The prairie sun beat down hard on the red earth, the kind of heat that could crack leather and make a man's throat feel like sandpaper. Dust swirled in lazy circles across the open land, and in the distance, the faint rattle of spurs could be heard along with the creak of an old saddle. The West was never a gentle place. It was raw, untamed, and unforgiving. Out here, a man's worth was measured not by words, but by the way he stood when trouble came knocking. It was a land of cattle thieves, whiskey-soaked saloons, and endless trails. Yet hidden beneath all that grit, stories of honor and sacrifice often found a way to take root. This is one such story. The man who sat quiet in the saddle that day wasn't looking for trouble. He was a cowboy like many others, broad-shouldered, with sun-worn skin and eyes sharp enough to read the horizon like scripture. He lived alone, tucked away in a cabin built from hand-hewn logs, miles from the nearest town. Folks who knew him would say he was steady as a mountain, a man who carried silence like a second skin. He wasn't one to go searching for company, and he surely wasn't one to step into matters that weren't his own. But sometimes fate doesn't ask for permission. Sometimes it pushes a man right into the middle of a storm he never expected. The sound carried before he saw it, voices raised, angry and sharp, bouncing off the canyon walls like echoes of a gunshot. He reined his horse closer, keeping to the brush line until the scene opened before him. There, in the clearing, a group of men stood with their hands tight on their ropes and whips. Their laughter was cruel, the kind that sent a chill crawling down a man's spine. And in the center, tied to a post, was a young native girl. Her dark hair tangled from the struggle, her wrists raw from the ropes that bit into her skin. Fear glimmered in her eyes, but there was fire there too. A spark that refused to be broken, even in the face of cruelty. The cowboy sat still for a moment, his jaw tight, his hand brushing the worn grip of the revolver at his side. This wasn't his fight. He told himself that. The land was full of disputes, and a man couldn't right every wrong. Yet something in her gaze, something unyielding, clawed at the part of him that still believed in decency. He could turn away, ride on, and let the day swallow him whole. Or he could make a choice that would change the course of his quiet life forever. The decision settled in his bones before he even realized it. He nudged his horse forward, slow and steady, the weight of the moment pressing down like the hot sun overhead. Let her go, his voice cut through the jeering, low but steady as thunder rolling in the distance. The men turned, their grins fading as they saw him, their lone rider. Wide-brim hat, shadowing eyes that spoke louder than words. One of them spat into the dirt, whip dangling loose in his hand, and sneered, "Ain't your business, cowboy? Best keep ridin'." But the cowboy didn't flinch. He dismounted, boots crunching on dry earth, his hand never straying far from his holster. Tension hung heavy in the air, thicker than smoke before a gunfight. It was the kind of moment where one heartbeat could decide life or death. What happened next wasn't quick or clean. Dust flew, curses filled the air, and the crack of gunfire split the silence of the prairie. By the time the smoke cleared, the men who had laughed so loud were scattered, some limping, others crawling, all of them with a new respect for the quiet stranger who had stepped into their cruelty and broken it apart with iron resolve. The girl, shaken but alive, was free. He cut the ropes with a swift blade, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. No words passed between them. None were needed. She slipped away into the trees, like a shadow melting back into the wild, and the cowboy rode off, dust trailing behind him as if the land itself was swallowing his tracks. That night, back at his cabin, the air was thick with silence. The cowboy sat on the porch, hat pulled low, watching the last streaks of sunlight fade into the horizon. His dogs lay quiet at his feet, ears twitching at the faint rustle of the wind through the grass. He didn't dwell on the fight. Out here, every day had its share of violence, and he'd long learned not to let blood and noise linger in his mind. Still, the look in that girl's eyes haunted him, the mixture of fear, strength, and something else he couldn't name. He tried to shake it off, telling himself she was gone, back to her people, back to a world far different from his own. But the prairie has its way of bending fate. And sometimes what you think is over has only just begun. The next morning dawned sharp and golden, the sky stretching wide as a promise. The cowboy rose with the sun, as he always did, moving through the rhythm of his chores with the same quiet precision. He split wood, drew water, checked the fences, all while the dogs trailed at his heels. It was a day like any other, until it wasn't, because as he bent to lay another log on the stack, he caught sight of movement down the trail. A figure was approaching, steady and sure, her shape framed by the rising sun. His hand froze on the axe handle, breath caught in his chest as recognition struck. It was her, the girl from the clearing, the one he had saved. She walked toward the cabin with her head held high, no longer bound, no longer trembling. The fire in her eyes was still there, but it burned different. Now calmer, focused as if guided by a purpose. In her hands, she carried something wrapped in deerskin, though he couldn't yet tell what it was. His dogs stirred, ears pricked, but they didn't growl. They seemed to sense what he felt, that this was no threat, but something else entirely. She stopped a few paces from the porch, her gaze locking on his. For a long moment, the world was silent. Only the wind whispering through the grass between them. "You saved me." Her voice was soft, steady, filled with weight far beyond her years. "Now I have come to pay you back." And with those words, the morning seemed to still, hanging on the edge of something unknown, something that would bind their fates tighter than either could have imagined. The cowboy stood frozen, his heart beating slow but heavy as the girl waited. The deerskin bundle clutched close to her chest. Whatever she had brought, whatever her purpose was, he knew this moment was only the beginning. Would he accept what she carried? Would he let her step into his world or turn her away to the wild once more? The answer lingered in the silence, heavy as the desert air, waiting to be written in the next chapter of their lives. The cowboy didn't move at first. He stayed where he was on the porch, one hand resting on the axe handle, the other hanging loose at his side. His eyes stayed locked on the girl, studying her the way he studied a horizon before a storm. She wasn't trembling now, not the frightened figure tied to a post like the day before. There was something new in the way she stood, proud, determined, and unshaken. The bundle in her hands seemed to carry more weight than its size should allow, as though it wasn't just some offering but something that carried meaning beyond words. His dogs shifted uneasily, circling near the porch steps. They sensed the same tension he did. A visitor was rare out here, and rarer still one who carried the past like a shadow over her shoulder. He finally set the axe aside, slow and deliberate, and straightened. The boards of the porch creaked under his boots as he stepped forward. "You don't owe me anything," he said at last, his voice low, steady as a riverbed stone. The girl's grip tightened on the bundle. "Yes, I do." Her words came out simple, but there was iron beneath them. She didn't waver. She didn't look away. He could tell she had come a long way to reach this point, not in miles, but in spirit. For a moment, silence fell again. The cowboy's gaze drifted to the horizon, then back to her. He wondered what her people would think of her coming here. He wondered if trouble would follow, because trouble had a way of finding those who stepped outside the path laid for them. And yet there she stood, fearless before him. "Come inside, then," he muttered. He opened the cabin door and stepped aside. She moved carefully, her eyes taking in the rough-hewn walls, the small table with a lantern, the rifle leaning against the corner, the shelf lined with old tins and jars. It wasn't much of a home, but it was all he had, and every piece of it was built by his own two hands. She stepped inside with the quiet grace of someone who had spent her life in open spaces. Where silence held more meaning than chatter, the cowboy shut the door behind them. The sound echoing through the small room, the girl placed the bundle on the table. When she unwrapped it, the sight caught him off guard. Inside was a necklace made of beads and bone, strung together with careful hands. Each piece was worn smooth, carrying years of history. He knew at once this wasn't something given lightly. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice softer now. "She told me it should be given to someone worthy, someone who proves their spirit is strong. Yesterday you proved it." The cowboy's brow furrowed. He wasn't used to gifts, let alone ones that carried such weight. "I don't need this," he told her. "It's not about need," she answered. "It's about honor." The words hung between them like smoke curling from a fire. He could see she wasn't going to take it back. She had made up her mind before ever stepping foot on his land. He let out a slow breath and nodded once. Carefully, he lifted the necklace, feeling its rough edges against his calloused fingers. He didn't put it on, but he didn't refuse it either. That small choice seemed to ease something in her posture. The cowboy poured water from the jug into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. She accepted it without hesitation. They sat across from each other at the table, the silence stretching. Neither seemed in a hurry to fill it. Words weren't easy things out here. They were like bullets best not to waste unless needed. Finally, he broke it. "Those men yesterday, who were they to you?" She looked into her cup, her dark hair falling forward. "They were traitors, men who came near our land before. They wanted something, always wanting. When we would not give it, they tried to take it. Yesterday, they thought I was alone. They thought they could make me bend." Her eyes lifted to his, burning with steady fire. They were wrong. The cowboy nodded, his jaw tightening. He had seen enough men like that in his time. Wolves dressed in human skin, feeding on weakness, mistaking cruelty for strength. He hated them, though he seldom let that hatred show. Out here, hate was as dangerous as thirst. It could eat a man hollow if he wasn't careful. "You'll need to be careful," he said. "Men like that don't forget." "I don't forget either," she answered. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, studying her again. She was young, maybe too young to be carrying the kind of weight she spoke with. But the prairie had a way of aging people before their time. He could see she was no stranger to hardship, no stranger to standing her ground even when the odds towered above her as the hours stretched. She shared little pieces of herself, though never too much. Her father had taught her to hunt, to track, to listen to the language of the land. Her mother had taught her the ways of honor, of traditions passed down like whispers from one generation to the next. She had siblings once, but sickness and raids had taken most. Her voice didn't waver when she spoke of loss. It was as though the land itself had taught her that pain was just another part of living. The cowboy listened more than he spoke. His own story wasn't one he told often. There was no tribe to remember him, no kin to call his name. He had drifted west with cattle drives, gun smoke, and broken trails. Somewhere along the way, he had chosen solitude over the company of men who couldn't be trusted. His cabin was his refuge, a place where the world's noise couldn't reach him. Until now, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long, the girl rose to leave. She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't look back as she stepped outside, the prairie wind tugging at her hair. He followed her to the porch, watching as she walked the trail away from his cabin, her figure small against the vast sweep of the land. The necklace still lay on the table inside, its presence heavier than iron. That night, the cowboy couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The prairie seemed quieter, though not in a peaceful way. It was the quiet before thunder, before the sky split open with lightning. He sat long into the night, pipe smoke curling around him, his dogs restless at his feet. Somewhere out there, the men he had faced weren't done. He could feel it in his bones. And now, because of the choice he made, neither was she. The next days passed slow but sharp. Every sound seemed louder. Every shadow stretched farther. When he rode the fence line, he caught himself scanning the horizon more than the posts. When he watered the horses, his hand lingered near the rifle. The land was wide, but word traveled faster than the wind. Men like those he'd driven off had a way of circling back, meaner than before. And then, just as the thought had taken root in him, it happened. On the third morning, while he was chopping wood, his dogs barked wild. The sound wasn't their usual bark at a rabbit or a bird. It was deeper, urgent. He dropped the axe and turned, his eyes narrowing. Down the trail, once again, a figure approached. But this time, it wasn't just one. The girl was there, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, 2 other figures followed at a distance, moving with caution. He couldn't yet see their faces, but he knew this was no ordinary visit. The land seemed to hold its breath as they drew nearer. the weight of whatever was coming pressing heavy on the cowboy's chest. He straightened, brushing the sweat from his brow, his hand inching toward the revolver at his hip. Trouble was walking right toward his cabin, carried on the boots of strangers and the silence of a girl who had already changed his life once before, and though he couldn't yet see the shape of it, he knew deep down his quiet days were gone. Something larger was unfolding, and he was already part of it. The cowboy stood still, the weight of the axe slipping from his grip as his eyes fixed on the trail. The girl walked with steady steps, her dark hair catching the morning light. But it was the two figures behind her that tightened the air. They moved slower, cautious, as if testing the ground with every step. The dogs barked again, circling near the porch, their hackles raised. The cowboy's hand rested near the revolver on his hip, but he didn't draw. Not yet. When they came close enough for him to see their faces, he saw they were men, older than the girl, their skin carrying the same sun-darkened hue and markings of her people. One carried a bow slung across his back, the other a long spear. They didn't look at him with open hostility, but neither did they carry trust. Their eyes flickered between him and the girl, sharp as blades. She stopped a few paces from the porch, her chin raised. "These are my kin," she said. "They came because they heard what you did." The cowboy gave a slow nod, keeping his voice even. "I meant her no harm." The man with the spear stepped forward, his gaze hard as flint. "You killed men," he said. His English was broken, but clear enough. "Men who will bring more when they rise again." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had no argument against that. Trouble was like wildfire once sparked. It spread fast, licking at everything in its path. The men he put down weren't the kind to forgive. And the prairie was wide, but not wide enough to keep them from circling back. The girl looked between them, her voice softer now. "He saved me. If not for him, I would be dead." Her words settled heavy in the air. For a moment, neither of the men spoke. Then the one with the bow finally nodded, though his eyes never softened. "Then his fate is tied to yours," he said. The cowboy understood what that meant, though the words were few. He wasn't just a passerby anymore, not just a man who had stumbled into a fight. He had been pulled into something larger, something that reached beyond his cabin walls and the fences he kept mending. That night, the girl stayed near the cabin again, though the two men camped at a distance, their fire a faint glow on the horizon. The cowboy couldn't sleep easy. He paced the porch, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance and the faint rustle of the prairie grass. He thought of the necklace lying inside, the beads and bones catching the flicker of lantern light. It wasn't just a gift. It was a chain linking him to something he didn't yet understand. The next morning, the girl spoke more freely. She told him of her people, how they had been pushed farther and farther from the rivers and hunting grounds, how traders and ranchers cut into their land, offering trinkets for what they had no right to take. The men he fought were part of that outsiders who came not to live with the land but to carve it up and claim it as their own. The girl's tribe was caught between survival and resistance, and she had become a target because she refused to bow. The cowboy listened, his silence steady. He had seen greed before. He had seen men carve lines on a map and call it ownership, though the earth itself belonged to no one. He had never spoken it out loud, but deep down, he had always felt the land was meant to be respected, not tamed like cattle. In her words, he found echoes of what he already believed, though he had never given voice to it. But belief didn't change the fact that men with guns would come looking. And when they did, they wouldn't stop at her. They'd burn down his cabin, drive him from the land, and leave nothing but ash behind. As the days stretched, the tension thickened. The men who had come with her didn't trust him, though they tolerated his presence. He caught them watching him when they thought he wasn't looking, their hands never far from their weapons. He didn't blame them. Trust was rare out here, rarer still between a lone cowboy and a people who had every reason to see outsiders as enemies. Yet there was something unspoken, a fragile thread that kept them from becoming foes. The girl was the bridge between them. She moved icily between the worlds, speaking to her kin in their language, then turning to him with English. Sometimes she would laugh softly at their cautiousness, as if she carried a certainty neither side could see yet. Other times he caught her staring out across the prairie, her face lined with a sadness too deep for her years. One evening, when the sky turned red with sunset, she told him more of her mother. The necklace, she explained, wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a symbol of strength, meant to be passed to someone who would carry responsibility. She had chosen him not because he was strong with a gun, but because he had stepped into cruelty when he could have turned away. That choice, she said, bound him to more than he realized. The cowboy felt the weight of those words. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who wanted quiet, who wanted the land and the dogs at his feet. But life had a way of dragging men into storms no matter how tightly they held the stillness. As the moon rose that night, he saw something move in the distance. A faint flicker, like torchlight, weaving through the hills. His hand went to the rifle, and his chest tightened. He wasn't the only one who saw it. The two men by the fire stiffened, their eyes narrowing at the horizon. Trouble wasn't just a thought anymore. It was here. The girl came to stand beside him, her eyes fixed on the glow. She didn't speak, but he could feel the tension in her shoulders, the way she braced herself. The cowboy's grip on the rifle tightened. He knew what this meant. The men he had scattered weren't done. They had gathered more, and they were coming back. The days that followed were restless. The girl's kin wanted to move her back to safety, deeper into the land where their people could shield her. She refused. She said leaving would only bring the fight to others. She wanted to stand where she had nearly fallen, to show those men they hadn't broken her. The cowboy respected her courage, though part of him wished she would leave. If she stayed, she would be in danger, and so would he. But if she left, she'd carry the fire of vengeance with her, and he'd be left to face the storm alone. The cowboy began to prepare in quiet ways. He checked the rifle again and again, cleaned his revolver, stacked wood higher against the cabin wall. He patched holes in the roof and laid out supplies in case of a long night. His dogs sensed his unease, pacing more than resting, their ears twitching at every sound. Yet even as he prepared, he knew wood and bullets might not be enough. He thought often of the girl's words about honor, about being tied to something larger than himself. He had spent his life avoiding ties. But now they were wrapped around him like ropes he couldn't cut. The girl, too, seemed to change. She spent more time near the cabin, asking him questions about his past, about the trails he had ridden and the towns he had passed through. Sometimes she asked about the men he had faced in his life, the choices he made. She seemed to be studying him, as though trying to understand the measure of a man who had stepped into her fate, and all the while, the horizon stayed uneasy. Riders moved in the distance some days, just shadows on ridges. Smoke curled from campfires too far to reach. The prairie was whispering of war, and neither the cowboy nor the girl could ignore it. One night, as the wind howled and the cabin shook against the storm, she came to him again with words that weighed heavier than the necklace she had given him. "They won't stop," she said. "Not with me, not with you. They want everything. The land, the people, the freedom. If we don't stand, they'll keep taking until nothing is left." The cowboy met her gaze, the storm rattling outside like gunfire. He didn't answer, but he knew she was right. He also knew that by saving her, he had set himself on this path. The fight wasn't just hers anymore. It was his. Still, deep down, he wondered if two people and the few who stood beside them could hold against the storm that was coming, and that doubt, sharp and quiet, gnawed at him as the thunder rolled across the plains. The prairie nights grew heavier with each passing day, as though the sky itself was bracing for something it couldn't hold back much longer. The cowboy sat on his porch most evenings with the rifle across his knees, his dogs restless at his feet, their ears twitching at the slightest rustle in the grass. The girl moved quietly around the cabin, her presence steady, but never without a shadow of worry in her eyes. She knew as well as he did that the men he had driven off weren't gone. They were gathering, waiting for their moment to strike back. Every small sign added weight to that fear. A broken branch along the trail where no horse should have passed, smoke rising in the distance when no camp should have been there. The dogs would bark at night for no reason he could see, their hackles raised as if scenting something carried on the wind. The cowboy had lived long enough to trust those instincts. The land had a way of whispering danger long before it came in plain sight. The girl's kin stayed close for a while, but the tension between them and the cowboy never fully eased. They respected what he had done, but mistrust lingered, born of long years when men who looked like him brought only pain. Still, they didn't leave completely. They camped in the hills, close enough to watch over her, far enough to show they didn't fully belong at his side. Some nights he'd catch the glow of their fire flickering against the sky, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone, even if the bond between them was fragile at best. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, the girl stood beside him, her voice quiet but sure. "They'll come soon," she said, "and when they do, they won't come just for me. They'll come for you too." The cowboy didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the line of hills in the distance, shadows stretching long across the prairie. He could almost see the riders there, waiting in silence, their cruelty as steady as the night wind. Finally, he said, "I reckon you're right. Will you fight with me?" She asked. Her words were not a plea. They were a challenge, a test of what kind of man he truly was. He turned to her, his face worn with years of dust and sun, and gave the smallest of nods. "I'll stand." That simple promise seemed to settle something in her. For the first time since she had come to his cabin, a faint smile touched her lips, though it faded quick. She knew the weight of the battle ahead. Smiles didn't last long on a land that thrived on hardship. The days that followed were spent in quiet preparation. The cowboy reinforced the cabin, stacking logs and stone where the walls were weakest. He cut fresh stakes to drive into the ground, forming a barrier around the small clearing. The girl gathered herbs and supplies, filling pouches with roots and leaves her mother had once taught her could ease pain or slow bleeding. The two men from her tribe helped in their own way, setting snares along the trails and leaving signs only they could read. They spoke little to the cowboy, but their actions showed they had chosen to stand with him, at least for now. At night, the tension grew thicker. Coyotes howled longer, owls flew lower, and every sound seemed sharper in the dark. The cowboy found himself waking often, hand on the revolver beside his bed, ears straining for footsteps that never came. The girl, too, slept lightly, her dreams restless, her face tight with unspoken fears. More than once, he found her standing at the window before dawn, staring out across the prairie as if she expected to see fire on the horizon, and then, one morning the fire came. It started as a faint glow far to the east, barely visible against the rising sun. The cowboy thought it was just another camp at first, but as the hours passed, the smoke grew darker, thicker, carried by the wind. By midday, the smell of it reached the cabin, sharp and bitter. His dogs barked until their throats were raw. The girl's kin returned from the hills, faces grim. "They burned the grass to smoke us out," one of them said. The cowboy's stomach tightened. It was an old trick, but a deadly one. Fire moved fast across dry land. If they weren't careful, it could box them in. Forcing them to run where the riders waited, the girl stood tall, her jaw set. "They want fear. They want us to break before they even arrive." The cowboy nodded. He knew she was right. Fear was their weapon, as much as the whips and rifles they carried. But fear only worked if you let it. That night, the glow of the fire grew closer. The horizon burned orange, and the wind carried sparks that drifted like restless spirits in the dark. The cabin stood solid, but the air around it felt alive, charged with something that made every breath heavy. The cowboy loaded his rifle again and again, checking the chamber as if repetition alone could ease the weight in his chest. The girl tied her hair back, her movements steady. Though her eyes betrayed the storm inside her, when dawn broke, they came. The first sound was distant hooves, faint but steady, like a drumbeat rolling across the earth. The cowboy stood on the porch, rifle in hand, as the figures appeared on the ridge. One by one, riders crested the hill, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. There were more than he expected. A dozen, maybe more, their numbers swelling like a tide. Each carried a rifle or whip, their faces twisted with the kind of arrogance born from cruelty unchecked. The girl stood beside him, unflinching. Her kin emerged from the trees, bows drawn, spears ready. The dogs growled low, circling the cabin like shadows waiting to spring. The cowboy's grip on the rifle tightened, the wood warm under his hand. The riders didn't rush. They moved slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. One at the front raised his hand, calling the group to a halt. His voice carried across the clearing, harsh and mocking. "You should have kept riding, cowboy," he called out. "This ain't your fight." The cowboy's eyes narrowed. "Seemed like my fight when you had a girl tied to a post." Laughter broke out among the riders, cold and sharp. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, sneering. "She ain't worth dying for. But if you want her that bad, you can die with her." The girl's eyes flared with anger, but she stayed silent. The cowboy didn't look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on the men before him. Every muscle in his body coiled tight. The riders began to spread out, circling slowly, their eyes darting between the cabin and the hills. They were testing the ground, looking for weakness. The cowboy could feel his heart pounding, slow but heavy, each beat echoing in his ears. The world seemed to narrow until there was nothing but the space between them and the enemy. The air charged with the promise of violence. The girl whispered, barely audible, "They'll come soon." The cowboy nodded once. Let him. The silence stretched unbearable, until at last a single shot rang out. It wasn't from his rifle, nor from the men at his side. It came from the riders, the crack of it tearing through the morning air. The bullet striking the cabin wall with a splinter of wood, and with that, the prairie erupted into chaos. The riders spurred their horses forward, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground. Arrows flew from the trees, slicing through the air. The cowboy raised his rifle, the recoil slamming into his shoulder as the first rider fell. Dogs lunged, snarling, teeth flashing. The girl grabbed a spear from her kin, standing her ground with fire in her eyes. The clearing became a storm of dust, smoke, and cries. The cowboy fired again and again, each shot deliberate, his breath steady despite the chaos. But for every man who fell, two more pressed forward. The riders shouted, their rage filling the air, their whips cracking like thunder. The cabin shook with the impact of bullets, its walls straining but holding. The fire on the horizon burned brighter, carried closer by the wind as if the land itself had joined the battle. The cowboy felt sweat sting his eyes, but he didn't falter. He had chosen this fight, and there was no turning back. The girl's voice cut through the noise, strong and fierce. "Hold the line." And in that moment, with the storm crashing around them, the cowboy knew this was the edge of everything. The fight was here, the moment they had dreaded, and there was no telling who would stand when the dust settled. The battle raged, and the prairie held its breath, waiting for the outcome that would change everything. The clearing was a storm of dust, smoke, and cries. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. The prairie grass flattened under the weight of pounding hooves and falling bodies. The cowboy's rifle cracked again, steady as his heartbeat, each shot chosen, never wasted. His revolver flashed in his other hand when the rifle emptied, the rhythm of it like a drumbeat against the chaos. Arrows whistled past him, spears thrust forward. Dogs lunged with snarls that cut through the screams of men. The girl's voice rose above it all, sharp and commanding, carrying courage in every word. It felt endless, the fight stretching until the line between night and day blurred. Riders crashed against the defenses, bullets ripped through the cabin walls, and still the cowboy stood. Every breath burned in his lungs, but he refused to falter. He thought of the necklace lying on his table, of the weight it carried, of the honor it meant. He thought of her fire, her refusal to bow. It kept his feet planted when the tide threatened to pull him under. Then, as quickly as it began, the noise started to break. The riders' numbers thinned, their shouts turned to curses, their confidence cracking. One fell from his horse with an arrow in his chest. Another turned and fled, panic written across his face. The fire they had started in the east burned wild, but the wind shifted. driving the flames back toward the hills instead of the cabin. Fate seemed to tilt just enough in their favor. The cowboy reloaded with trembling hands, sweat stinging his eyes. His dogs circled back to him, panting, their coats streaked with dust. The girl still stood, spear gripped tight, her chest heaving but her eyes unbroken. Her kin pressed forward, their voices raised in fierce cries as they drove the last of the attackers into retreat. Hooves pounded away into the distance, fading until only silence remained. Heavy and absolute, the cowboy lowered his rifle, his breath ragged. His body ached, his shoulder bruised from recoil, but he was alive. Around him, the clearing bore the scars of the fight-splintered wood. Torn earth, the fallen bodies of men who had come with hate in their hearts. The girl's kin moved among them, checking for signs of life, finishing what needed to be finished. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. The girl stepped toward the cowboy, her face streaked with dirt and smoke. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she spoke. They won't come back. He studied her, the strength in her posture, the fire still burning in her eyes. He knew she was right. Men like that didn't linger once they were broken. The land had a way of swallowing them, the same way it swallowed dust and bones. But he also knew this victory came with a cost. The prairie wasn't safer now, not truly. It never would be. It was just quieter for a time. Inside the cabin, the necklace still lay where he had left it. He picked it up that night, turning it over in his hand. Its beads caught the lantern light, each piece carrying years of history. He thought of her mother, of the words she had spoken about honor, about spirit. He wasn't sure he was worthy of it, but he understood now why she had given it. It wasn't just a gift. It was a reminder, a promise. The days that followed were filled with quiet work. They buried the dead far from the cabin, marking the graves with simple stones. The girl's kin spoke in low voices, prayers whispered to the sky. The cowboy stood apart, his hat in his hands, giving them their space. When it was done, the prairie looked the same as it always had, endless. Untamed, but those who lived on it knew it had changed. The girl's kin prepared to return to their people. They had fought beside the cowboy, and though mistrust still lingered, there was a bond now forged in blood. Before they left, the man with the bow paused, his sharp gaze softening for the first time. "You stood," he said simply. It wasn't thanks. It was acknowledgement. The cowboy gave a single nod, knowing it was all that was needed. When they were gone, only the girl remained. She didn't leave with them, not yet. Instead, she stayed near the cabin, moving through the days with the same quiet strength. She gathered herbs, mended what had been broken, and tended to the animals with care. Sometimes she spoke of her people, their stories, their traditions. Sometimes she sat in silence, staring out across the land, lost in thoughts too heavy for words. The cowboy didn't ask why she stayed. He didn't press her for answers. He had learned long ago that some things couldn't be forced. She would leave when she was ready, and when she did, he would let her go. But until then, her presence filled the cabin in a way it had never been filled before. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with fire, she stood beside him on the porch. The prairie stretched endless before them, the horizon glowing with fading light. "You didn't have to fight," she said softly. "No," he answered. "But I did." She nodded, her gaze steady on the horizon. "That's why I gave you the necklace. Not because you saved me. Because you chose the harder road." He turned the words over in his mind, letting them settle deep. He had lived a life avoiding ties, avoiding roads that led to more than his own survival. But here in the heart of the prairie, he had stepped onto a path that tied him to something greater. It wasn't comfort he had found, nor peace. It was something sharper, something truer. The days turned to weeks. The land healed slowly, grass growing where fire had licked, silence settling where gunfire once roared. The cowboy returned to his work splitting wood, mending fences, riding the trails. The girl helped, her hands quick and capable, her spirit unyielding. There was a rhythm to it, a fragile piece stitched together from the wreckage of what they had endured. But even in that piece, the cowboy knew the land would never truly rest. The West was not a place of quiet endings. It was a place of constant struggle, where every day was earned. Yet as he watched the girl walk across the clearing, her steps steady, her head high, he felt something stir in him. Not hope exactly, but something close. One morning, she came to him with her decision. She would return to her people. They needed her, and she belonged with them. Her voice was calm, but her eyes lingered on him longer than words could explain. He nodded, though a weight settled in his chest. Before she left, she placed her hand on the necklace still hanging by his side. "Keep it," she said. "Not as a debt." As a reminder, he met her gaze, the silence between them carrying more than any words could. Then she turned, walking down the trail, her figure growing smaller against the vast prairie until the horizon swallowed her. Hole the cowboy stood for a long time, the dogs quiet at his feet, the wind carrying the faint scent of wildflowers across the land. He touched the necklace, feeling the rough edges against his calloused fingers. He knew he would never be the same. The cabin remained, the land stretched wide, and the silence of the prairie returned. But now it carried a different weight. The cowboy had faced the storm and stood through it, not just for himself, but for something larger. In that choice, he found meaning where once there had only been solitude, and so he stayed. The quiet guardian of a land that asked much and gave little. His spirit tied forever to the girl who had walked into his life and changed its course. The prairie would test him again, as it always did, but he no longer faced it alone in his heart. He carried her strength, her fire, the promise of honor that could never be broken. The sun sank low, painting the sky with the same colors it had on the day they first met. The cowboy sat on his porch, the necklace hanging from his neck now, his rifle resting close at hand. The land stretched before him, endless and wild. And though the future was uncertain, he was ready to meet it. For in the heart of the old American West, where struggle and survival wrote every story, he had found one worth keeping. And that story, etched into the prairie itself, would live on long after the dust of this battle had settled.